Okay, so thank you everyone for coming. I want to present here preliminary results from a project that is funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. The title is Polycentric Multilateralism, Reimagining the Roles of International Institutions in Space Governance and Beyond. The idea behind this project is to take all the knowledge that was accumulated in the Ostrom Workshop, the work that Elinor Ostrom, Vincent Ostrom, and all other scholars, some of them are here, did about polycentric governance and the design principles, and try to take it to space, meaning taking it from local commons to global commons, but more than that, to global affairs in general, not just for resources or areas that are commons, local, large, global, but also to trans-border issues. It's a project I'm working with Scott, and Giovanni joined us months ago and already did a lot of work and a lot of help. So these are preliminary results. Scott is not here today. He's in Arizona. He's supposed to join us online. Maybe he will join in a few minutes. Okay. Yes. So this is roughly the outline, talking about the collective action problem in the context of global affairs, applying the IAD framework to space governance, rushing through the merits of the polycentric governance for local commons. This will be very short. You all know that this is well established, and the issue more important for today is how to take it from local commons to large-scale commons to global commons and eventually to global affairs, and then to see what does it mean when we say polycentric multilateralism. So it all starts and ends with a collective action problem. The collective action problem is when we need to achieve a common goal. There is a goal that cannot be achieved by an individual. It needs to be by collective action, but the incentive structure is such that individuals have incentives to act in a way that does not lead to an optimal outcome. And the problem was tragedy of the commons, etc. This is one of the oldest problems in human societies, basically since human gathering started. The literature on collective action problem is at least since the Greeks. I know that there is Greek literature about it. If there is before or elsewhere, might be also. These are milestones in the study of a collective action problem. Ostrom's book from 1965, The Logic of a Collective Action. Here's another book from 82. And of course, the tragedy of the common, which is one of the most cited articles in the social sciences. And he's very dramatic in his words. Ruin is the destination toward which all men rush. This was on this background, Elinor Ostrom started to work to study various institutional arrangements for the management of pool resources. Now to global affairs. So the collective action problem exists between individuals who need to cooperate to manage a fishery, forest, and other things, but it also applies between political entities. And this also dates back to the early encounters between political entities. Some suggest that the international system started 500 BCE. Where we stand today, the international system is such that there is no global authority or a global sovereign. The United Nations is not a parliament. It is up to the states to cooperate. All the treaties that we have, I ignore for a moment customary international law, but most of international law is made by collective action. Countries come together, discuss a treaty, adopt a treaty. This is collective action. In this type of collective action, we also have the problems that are generally associated with collective action, different interests, different incentives. You might want to join, but to join an arrangement, but not comply with it fully, because you have an incentive to free ride, etc. So the first thing that so when we are trying to apply polycentric governance to outer space, we start by thinking of how to apply the international development, international institutional analysis, yes. The institutional analysis and development framework to space governance. The reason that we want to do that is it will help us to understand information flows under alternative institutional arrangements, diagnose problems in existing institutional arrangements, and predicting, at least in some cases, the outcomes. We were thinking if the IAD framework will be better, or the SCS framework. The SCS is kind of a development of the IAD, and we chose, from the reason that I will not discuss here, to focus on the IAD framework. Some caveats when we talk, when we will mention rules and participants. There are different types of rules, and there are different types of participants. Not all participants here are equal. When we talk about fisheries, the fishermen might be more or less equal. Some have more power, some less, but they all have a fishing boat, and they all do fishing. When we talk about space governance, it is a larger and more varied population. You have countries that do not have space activities, but are part of the UN forums. You have countries that have activities along a broad range, like the US, China, and Russia, and you have countries that only some activities, and then you have corporations, NGOs, etc. So this is our attempt to apply the IAD framework space governance. The boxes are the same boxes that are from that are in all the literature about the ID framework. I think this one is from McGuinness paper. And then we try to apply to our context. In terms of the left column about the exogenous variables, in terms of the biophysical and material conditions, it's outer space. It's a very harsh environment. It's hard to be there. It is hard to access it, which limits the number of actors. In terms of the attributes of the community, there are community. It has all sorts of actors from national space agencies and companies and NGOs and also states. There are domestic pressures. There are strategic interests. There are ideals. There are visionary people. I'm talking about the visionary billionaires like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson, people who made billions elsewhere and now have a vision to do something new in outer space. Rules in use, we have basically two types. So let's start with the constitutional rules. It's basically the UN Charter. And then we have legally binding rules, which is the UN Space Law Treaties, mainly the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. But what we see in the last 2 decades, at least, is more and more non-binding instruments, guidelines, and other type of instruments that are not legally binding. When I go to the second column, the action arena, so the action situation or where the interactions happen, the main places where the interaction happens is in the UN Committee on the Peaceful Usage of Outer Space that has more than 100 members, and all actors, especially the leading actors, but almost everyone goes there and meet and exchange views, ideas, and whatnot. There are also smaller forums. There is, for example, the interagency Space Debris Mitigation Committee, which is a committee of few spacefaring nations. I think it's less than 10 even. So it's a smaller forum of the leading space agencies. And then there are groups like the Hague Group. It's forums that are convened by a university research center. This one is by the Leiden Institute of Air and the Space Law. There was another one by the McGill Institute of Air and Space Law. They convene experts from around the world. There are scholars, people from the government, and from the industry. Conferences is another place where actors meet and exchange views and information. They are less a place to make decisions. Also, this also happens, but it's more of a meeting place. when we talked about fishermen, someone, maybe Mike, gave the example of that all fishermen later meet in the bar. And so conferences, but also the UN are kind of the bar where all the actors meet and they talk. Next, we go to participants. We have states and we have corporations, and we have all sorts of UN organs. It's the UN General Assembly, the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, the Conference on the Disarmament, and then you have some coalitions, like the US is now building the Artemis coalition. China and Russia have their own cooperation. We move to interactions. The interactions, not surprisingly, are dominated to an extent by the leading spacefaring nations, US, Russia, China, US probably more than the others, but it also depends on the forum. When we talk about the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, majority of the countries there are developing country. It's a forum where developing countries have more power than the leading countries. It is a committee that adopts decision by consensus, and therefore they have more power. I think I will need to rush a bit. In terms of evaluative criteria is basically if you can introduce new rules, and if there is compliance with those rules, and if there is compliance, then the outcomes, the results hopefully should be good. So outcomes can be rules, but then there is the issue of compliance. So this is our attempt to apply the IID framework to space governance, and we would love to hear some comments about it. The merits of the polycentric governance, I will sum it up with those three. It facilitates collective action. It produces better fitting rules, meaning rules that have a better fit to the conditions, and there is also more compliance. Actors tend more to comply with rules that they participate in their creation. In addition, Ostrom found also 8 design principles, and there is correlation between those design principles and the efficacy, or how much a governance system is working well. It's not a recipe for success. It doesn't always work, but there is kind of a correlation. And one of the questions is if those design principles that were tested on local commons, if they apply also in as we go up to large-scale commons, global commons, and global affairs. So there are already some thinking about applying a polycentric governance and the design principles to higher scale. So Ostrom wrote a paper for the World Bank about climate change, and climate change is somewhere between global commons or global affairs issue. The atmosphere is global common, but climate change is more about how we manage it. So it's maybe like a global issue. and her ideas were similar to what she wrote about local commons. She said that it's a classic collective action problem that is best addressed at multiple scales and level, and she proposed polycentric approach. Another work about climate change, adopting, applying, or suggesting to apply a polycentric governance to climate change. Again, it is an issue of global affairs, and the advantages of polycentric approach would be opportunities for experimentation and increased communication. So in a bit earlier article, Ostrom and Yes and Paul Stern noted that the design principles are likely to be applicable to regional and global resources, but they were less tested on those scales. And then there was, in 2014, a special issue of the International Journal of the Commons that tried to do that, to test the design principles to large-scale commons. In this case, social ecological systems. They analyzed 5 cases using the same coding manual and methodology and the set of variables. These are the cases. And their conclusions is that they found support for some of the design principles, boundaries, monitoring, sanctions, fit to conditions, and conflict resolution mechanisms. But for other principles, there were mixed results. So at least when we talk about large-scale commons, the design principles, we have mixed results, but also, as we said from the beginning, it's not a recipe for success. It doesn't work all the time. Other works by Eric Norman. Now, when we try to take it to global affairs, so there are already the discussion about it in a book that Elinor Ostrom co-edited with Robert Keohane, which is one of the leading international relations scholars. And they said that many of the design principles appear relevant also to problems of international cooperation. Oran Young talked about the issue of the scale. And Keohane concluded that we have unexploited opportunity to apply Elinor Ostrom's theory to global affairs. And this is one of the justifications for this project. 92, there are another terms. And Ostrom, the conclusions of the research on a small scale setting are relevant to analysis of international cooperation. So there are other suggested Vincent Ostrom, building on medicine, suggested or contemplated applying it to all levels of human affairs. So what would it mean to apply a polycentric governance to global affairs? It kind of means that we distill polycentric governance. We don't have to talk only about commons, whether it is local commons, large-scale commons, global commons. basically to look at those principles as they apply for cooperation. The Nobel Committee noted that Ostrom's observations are important not only to the study of natural resource management, but also to the study of a human cooperation more generally. And this is what we are trying to do here. At the end, the global affairs are addressing transnational challenges are done by international cooperation. What would polycentric multilateralism means? It means that the roles of the long-standing international institution would adapt. There will be more forums in addition to that, more type of instruments, notably non-binding. And when we talk about local experimentation, it can be geographic, but it also can be in terms of small groups or informal forums. The multilateral institutions will be less monocentric decision-making center and more of a hub where actors meet, and also where the other instruments that were adopted in other forums are brought for discussion and adoption. And they would also work to ensure the global public interest and the interest of actors that are underrepresented in other forums. This is kind of already happening. Which was the legal advisor of the State Department during the Obama administration, he noted from his experience that the 21st century international lawmaking is not a Westphalian top-down process of treaty making. Rather, it is a dynamic interaction of private and public actors in a variety of the fora to generate norms. And he talked about their cooperation. I also discussed it in the context of a space governance. So this is kind of already happening. To conclude, polycentric approach, which proved as a better fit to local commons. We think that it's also good for global commons and to global affairs more generally. This also means adapting the roles of the international institutions and the type of instrument that we have. And we think that it's especially more important now that global politics is more complicated, the fusion of power, contests the multilateralism, etc. And I will stop here. Thank you for coming and listening, and I welcome your comments.
Okay, I can be in charge of the queue if you want. Or want to start? Do you have any? Mike and Bernie, I don't know who was first.
Where do you go first? Because I may take a while.
Bernie first.
So I come away with the idea from you that this is something we ought to study. It's really big, it's really complicated. It's an extension of Eleanor's work and beyond. But we really don't know anymore. I was searching for more detail, more something concrete, and I kind of got just a big picture that hey, there's a whole lot going on here. It's probably polycentric. everything, but I didn't. I guess as a workshopper, I'd say sure. But I don't know that I was convinced any more than that. And if I wasn't a workshopper, I'd come away disappointed.
So maybe you're and correct me wrong, well, how do we actually test it, or how do we actually prove that it is also good for global affairs? This is your question?
Yeah, I mean, we know global affairs are really complicated and messy. And the implication is this would be a good way to look at it. But you really didn't look at it.
Yeah, so here we have an issue that we will need to address, because we were supposed to do it by analyzing a certain data set that now we might not be able to analyze. So we need to look for a different way to actually test it. So we do have an issue here.
I think this is the detail that Mike's going to get to. So I'm going to say, okay.
Yeah, and I have some suggestion too, but.
Thanks for that setup, Bernie.
I might set you up.
Yeah,
Should I
yeah,
time you, Mike, or
yeah.
should I time you?
You need to rein me in at some point. I'm trying to reduce it down. That gave me a little bit too. I did listen to you, but it gave me a little bit of time to, on another track, use down my points. Yeah, Bernie's hit it right on the head there, that you brought in a lot of things. In some ways, you didn't bring in enough, but we can talk about that sort of stuff later, because you brought in a lot. And listening to you, let me suggest sort of a different path through here that might lead you towards something a little more concrete at the end. It may not be exactly what you want to go to, but it's an idea. First, I would question the way you're laying out the history of global governance. Okay. And you're giving the United Nations way too much credit. Okay. Because I would say that I used to teach international law back in the day. There's sort of a two-track process in international law. One is the Westphalian model, treaty making, and all of that. And frankly, the UN is kind of a offshoot of that. It's a consequence of a treaty and stuff like that. But there's also been this other track, which is, I guess, sort of common law at the global level, mercantile law, commercial law, business law, that distinction is following through in space here. I mean, there's stuff happening at the UN, and there's stuff happening by these technical groups. Okay, they've always been separate. You had a really good comment about in your conclusions box from the IAD figure that there's obviously these small number of big powers that sort of dominate things, but then there's lots of other stuff going on they can't control because the information flow doesn't go through the great powers. It's these technical people getting together and making relations, including economic actors and stuff like that. So there's kind of that already, that separation. So there's always been kind of a separation in the global sort of level. But to me, so partially the UN isn't really a separate track. It's sort of an outgrowth of the Westphalian model, trying to, or has aspirations to, becoming the single governance structure for the world as a whole, but ain't never going to get there. At least not in any of our lifetimes, certainly not. I think there's a big split in there that you can make use of. One is there's these international forums where people talk about space, and then there's places where people actually do it. The difference between talking about space and doing it. And the UN, that's where they talk about. You list your action situations and stuff. Most of those were UN or forum sort of things, and that's fine. There's a lot of talk about that. But what's really interesting in space is there's a lot of stuff going on where people, organizations, corporations, agencies are doing things in space, and they're developing resources, and they're putting stuff up in space without getting anyone's permission because they didn't need anybody's permission, doing these things. So there's this separation already. So you've got two tracks of action situations, the talking and the doing, okay? And you've got all the talking. And interestingly, your conclusion about the talking side, because you get the UN is sort of what's happening with the UN. Well, there's not a lot of treaty making, and there's not a lot of new, international treaty going on. There's all these sort of small side agreements and stuff like that. Well, that is what's going on in that. What's really happening is a step outside the whole system, outside the whole governance system. You know, the tech industry and the different countries getting involved in the space and stuff like that. That's where the action is. And all that action is missing in what you're sort of talking about. So I think you can use that split.
So,
Please, yes, before I get too far deep.
so indeed, most of the action or most of the rulemaking that is made now is outside the UN, like the Interagency Committee on Space Debris at The Hague, etc. But at the end, they also bring it to the UN. So after they did their work, they bring it to the UN. It was adopted by the UN committee and then by the UN General Assembly. So the UN cannot produce these documents, but it is still a forum that you prefer that would adopt it because it will give it a more credibility.
Yeah. It's still where they talk about it, and it gets some legitimacy by going through there. But the real action is what the guys making the agreements. Okay, and that's still not in your analysis anywhere explicitly enough. So I think you manage that, have that sort of separation. And I think the other aspect of this, another point on this. You make a good connection to Lynn's work and Dan's work on polycentric governance of climate. Okay. And it's definitely messy. It's definitely polycentric. There's definitely a congruence between there. But climate law has something going for it that space law doesn't have. Climate policy has a theme, a dominant theme, reducing emissions and somehow restricting climate. Space, not so much. Why? Because there's all this stuff going on and there's no commonality of what's going on here. You know, what is the theme? What is the theme? What is the theme?
There are many things.
Yeah, there are many things. So all this stuff is going on. And so it's going to be even more difficult to imagine a polycentric governance of space policy or space commons than there is of climate commons, because there's at least one sort of unifying theme that ties everything together. And this is not tied together. So there's a real practical difficulty there. And I'm glad to see Dan's ready to come in on this. One more point before I give up I send back the rest of my time to someone else. The SESMAD project is a good example. I'm glad you read that. I recommended that to you, and I think that's a really good sort of thing. I would use that not as a source of conclusions, but as a source of an idea of what you might do in the future. Okay. I think if you do a SESMAD project on the space commons, you know, they looked at 5 or 6 really big international regimes of different sorts of things. I think, you know, the ocean law was in there. I don't know what else was all in there. And they came up with these conclusions. If you do that same thing to all these little things going on here in the real action in the space policy, if you look at communications, if you look at you know, missions to other planets, if you look at all the things that are going on there, trying to bring resources back into planning, all sorts of things, that there would be, each of those would have their own characteristics. So it's not just 2 tracks. You've got 2 tracks, one of which is all these little treaties that you're talking about in these agreements, and the other is all this stuff that's really going on over here. And I really think to get anything to answer Bernie's sort of questions, you got to get over here and talk about what's actually going on in space. What's going on? What is the action that all these people over here are reacting to that you'll miss if you just look at the US? Dan had a single finger there. I yield some of my time to this.
The extent I can remember what I was saying. It just seemed, I think you're separating them too much. Right?
Perhaps.
The agreements are about something. The US bilateral agreement with Japan, the US working group with India on space law. These are ongoing negotiations. They're not about complete non-issues, right?
I'm not saying that.
And then the other thing I want to say, in some ways, the climate regime is bound to be more polycentric than the space regime, in part because there are so few parties that have access to space relative to the climate change problem. But that's also a virtue in the sense it makes agreement easier because there are fewer players and less heterogeneity.
So I can see that they don't have a single unifying theme, which helps, but they have more actors, which kind of helps.
But I do
If
think
you have fewer actors here, it should be easier.
the point is well taken is, when you're talking the IID flow, you need to be issue specific, right? So there are all these adjacent action arenas that are, some are going to involve different actors than others. Maybe a group of them will involve all the same actors, right? You're talking about space debris, space junk.
Military uses of outer space is like a smaller issue. I mean, there are a few actors. Debris affects more countries, so it's different from. And this is the Conference on Disarmament and other UN Forum, group of government experts, etc. And this.
So I think it goes back to Bernie's initial point. If from the start, you're more concrete about the problems. Start with the problems.
Yeah, exactly.
Let me go with the suggestion. Yeah, so or do you want to answer?
That's also like. You mean even like limit the study to military users of outer space or to
Not
space?
necessarily, this could still be a framing paper, but you need some examples of the kinds of problems.
So that IID table, we might need like 4 tables, like 1 for each issue even.
Not necessarily, just recognizing when you just drop adjacent action situations, which are usually just behind the action situation you're talking about. And then when you discuss them in the paper, you recognize that there are different issues involving different players. You might give a few examples of them, but the problem should come, the problems, right, should come before the IID analysis. Yes.
Okay, let me suggest you something in that direction. It's like going back to like first principles in some senses, like, so think about the fishery, okay? So what's the key problem there? If I keep fishing, then I'm increasing the cost of others fishing, and that's what generates the externality, the collective action problem, the public good, however you want to call it, the prisoner's dilemma problem, that then they need to govern and solve, okay? So I would start just saying, what is this problem in space, okay? Because my feeling is like, let's compare with the fishery, no? Let's start increasing, let's put a tax on fishing, no? And then at some point, you are never underfishing, no? So essentially it's like, if the access to the resource is so costly, so there is no common pool problem or an externality problem, no? So, so I would start with that, identifying exactly what are the areas in which I am launching a satellite, and then I am using this orbit, and I will be interfering with the orbit of somebody else. So the externalities there, I need to coordinate and start talking about these issues.
That's a good point, because you have different problems of different nature. So the space debris problem is more of a pollution problem, what we know from environmental. But when you talk about military uses of outer space, is another problem of disarmament, of like limiting the arms race, or so it's a different type of problem. And when you're talking about exploitation of the resources, mining, and that it's a distributive problem, basically. Who can access property rights and the distribution?
Yeah, so I would start like starting from the problems. These are the issues, okay? They are, and then identify, as you said, so this is essentially a defense issue, okay? This is essentially, it's kind of a, a security dilemma type of problem, no? This is a typical common problem closer to whatever, climate change in nature, no? This is a problem of whatever. So essentially identify the problems, and then start seeing the governance, so how they are dealing with these problems. No? So how these problems are changing over time, and how the governance structure is changing to deal with these issues, and then you are calling the framework to study this, okay? But the problems are the driving force, no?
The comparison will be different because the space debris will compare to climate change or pollution,
Yes.
but the military uses is to disarmament issues, more like the agreements between US and the Soviet Union or now Russia. Like, so like sometimes it's
Yes.
bilateral and not even polycentric, right? You only need 2 actors or now maybe 3.
Yes. So I would say that would be a
So the polycentric is like generally you have many forums, but the forums for militarization typically need 3 countries. And this is the forum for that. And for debris, a different forum with many countries or a forum that's there. So
yeah, and the security issue, I know it may have some features of a collective action problem, but it may not. Let me give you an example. If you have coalition formations, you immediately have a collective action problem because you may free ride the other members of your coalition. But a pure security thing, let's say with 2 players, so there are no possibilities of free riding essentially, it's more difficult to think what is the collective action problem there, no? It's more about, and then even at internal level.
but not,
Yes.
there is a compliance issue, will the other side comply? So,
Yeah, so they may be facing some kind of equivalent of a security dilemma or prisoner's dilemma style with respect to armed races, something like that, okay? And they may agree, oh, by the way, if we can monitor some reduction of arming, it's good for us. So again, then you repeat again the same structure. It's like reducing fishing, no? The product has the same nature, no? So, but then making those links, I think, especially for those that don't know those links, could be super valuable, no?
Yeah, so I was thinking of 2 other potential issues, one that's sort of in the future and something for consideration, and then something that's sort of already been solved, maybe a case study to look at. So the first one that still probably will be an issue is the use of low Earth orbit. And as more and more satellite constellations are in low Earth orbit, what are the access questions for space nations and other nations that maybe don't have as developed of a space enterprise? And then sort of an issue that could be used as perhaps a success case is the telecommunications issue, which has sort of been regionalized within the ITU. And then even, at the local level is administered by governments and then local authorities. So maybe that's also a potential idea to look at.
Low Earth orbit is indeed a problem. I mean, there are more and more now with the mega constellations. We're talking about tens of thousands of the satellites that are planned, increasing the numbers of satellites. So between 57 and a few years ago, it was like 6,000 altogether, around that. And we will get to 100,000 in a few years. So it is indeed an issue.
Yeah, I just want, you mentioned in response to a question a few minutes ago that a purely bilateral agreement is not really polycentric. But it can be part of a polycentric system. Right? So you don't lose sight of the possibility that, for example, in the climate regime, the US-China bilateral working group on climate change, which reached some kind of agreement in 2013, really stimulated the move towards agreement on the Paris Agreement in 2015. So these negotiations at lower levels, and agreements at lower levels, can have knock-on effects well beyond, the value of the bilateral agreement itself.
Yes, it is. You're right. I mean, even though it is bilateral, it's part of a polycentric system, because the idea is that you don't have one forum that makes all the rules. The rules are outsourced to other forums. Some of the other forums are multilateral, some are lateral, others are off UN, like the group of government experts, which are kind of under the auspices of the UN, and others are totally removed from the UN. But they're all part of this polycentric group. That decision-making is.
I want to suggest that all international agreements are inevitably polycentric. Because the agreement depends on actions at the national level, right? Like ratification of a treaty by the US Senate, which may or sometimes doesn't actually occur. And then by actions taken by whether or not the treaty's been ratified, how it's being implemented, if at all, by one or another presidential administration, and whether the way it's being implemented actually causes private enterprise to reduce emissions or whatever they're supposed to do in the national rule that's supposed to be in compliance with the international. So I don't think there's any such thing as a non-bilateral, non-polycentric treaty.
Yep. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to see if we have questions from.
Oh, sorry,
One issue that we have now is how to test it, because it is one thing to build on the previous work that was done at the Ostrom Workshop mainly, and the other project that I mentioned, but we were planning to do our own test to analyze a certain data set that maybe we'll not be able to analyze. So kind of this is still an open question for us, how we test, how we bring our own validation that the polycentric governance is also good for global affairs.
It's again a great lead in. It's exactly where I was going to go. You sort of clarified my point. These comments have been great because they really clarified. If you start with 4 or 5 analytically distinct collective action problems related to the space commons, and we've talked about them. Telecommunications is one that's handled pretty well. Military use, not so well. Potential future resource use when they start going up and claiming part of the moon or something. Scientific monitoring and stuff. There's sort of a lot of science involved in that. Like maybe we shouldn't shoot down these balloons if they're actually scientific or something. And the low Earth orbital debris sort of problem and use and stuff. Those are 4 or 5 different issues. What you can do is take those 4 or 5 issues and see what are the conditions in those 4 or 5 issues on the variables that the SESMAD project examined, on the design principles. Use those as starting points for your variables and whatever other variables you want to bring in, and see how do they configure in these 4 or 5 different areas, so that space commons is not one, I said a polycentric governance or one regime. It's at least 5. Okay, 5 different ones, because the design principles that Lynn came up with mean something different in the fisheries than they do in a forest or than they do in an irrigation system. I mean, analytically they're the same, but they mean something. They're measured by something different. Well, that's going to happen in your 5 distinct areas of space governance or space commons. The design principles, if they're there and are important, they're going to be different things. See what I mean?
Yes.
And that's what the SESMAD folks were dealing with, in that they were trying to apply these variables that were not just the design principles, but also other variables from the collective action literature. There's generically about 30 sort of the people come up. Agarwal had a good piece on that a while back. There were 30 variables that are relevant. But what are the values of those 30 variables in those 5 different ones? Which ones are going to be most conducive to what kinds of collective action? There's your empirical analysis right there. But you got to start with dividing the space commons or the space governance problem up into substantively different problem sets.
So for each them checking the variables, But there is also a question there, which are the users? When we talk.
They're gonna be different in the 5 ones. They're gonna be totally different set of users.
Users, it's easy. Military users of space, is it only China, Russia, US, or others? This is.
You gotta do the analysis on each of those. You gotta count the actors.
What Mike's suggesting is that your analysis is more qualitative than quantitative, which I think you were getting at, looking at data sets.
You gotta know what you're measuring to start with. And when you're gonna measure different things, in these different, you're gonna measure pieces of space junk in one, you're gonna measure, you know, how many, how much resources have been brought back yet. Well, not so much yet. Or how many military uses, I mean, how many communications, you know, there's all kinds of different things, but you need to break it up into pieces so that you can handle it.
So one more suggestion, and unfortunately we're running out of time, but also I think it would be nice to more of a description of what the actors are actually doing, and then in terms of the treaties or the agreements, what they are agreeing to do. Essentially, we understand that there are promises, but they are promising. So if you go and see a trade agreement, I am promising to reduce trade barriers on X% in the following 5 years. So what is the nature of these agreements? Because maybe one possible paper within the big projects to explain why they are agreeing on what and in what circumstances and which countries, which players. So it's like a little bit of a theory and then checking on the agreements on space. So, and that could be, you know, it's like a version of trade agreements, but on space, you know? So it's
The comparison for trade agreements will show that trade agreements are usually specific. The tariff would be this, you will have quota or not quota, you have details. And in the space agreements, it's general principles.
That's gonna change once it really starts getting here. Then it's gonna get very.
Still going to be an important difference though, because the trade agreements are more easily enforced than any public international law issue.
And the interests are different. In a trade agreement, you want certain specific commitments, so you pay with like certain commitments. When you talk about space, basically the big actors don't have an interest to undertake all sorts of obligations, except for a few that are relevant to them. So limiting some kind of weapons or that. But beyond that, big actors might be better off with having a free hand to do whatever they want, which is sometimes what they are leading to.
See, these big.
This interesting, no? It's like
Trade regimes are made up by big actors dealing with small problems, problems that are particularly important to specific sorts of industries and stuff. And so, you know, the national governments aren't necessarily interested in how many fish get caught or whatever like that, but it's important to some of their interest groups. Okay, so it's still where there's still a difference between where the action is and then talking about it and monitoring it and stuff like that. So I haven't said anything about the UN. When you look at these 5, you don't need to talk about the UN and what's happening with these 4 units. The UN is going to come in and try to put some sort of a general principle structure on this and call it global governance. But you're not there yet. You're not there yet. You got to know what are the problems, what's been developed already by the people who are involved in each of those areas. On their own, yes, they're meeting together in UN, stuff like that. But the UN's got nothing to do with it. The whole act, you got to go where the action is. That's where the whole story of the international regime literature in international relations has been, you know, most of the international relations research initially dealt with military treaties and things like that. But all along, there were all these commercial agreements were being developed, technological agreements were being developed, and they kind of were, you know, legitimized by being put into the UN. And there's a lot of international organizations, some that have joined the UN system, some that haven't. I still don't think the International Telecommunications Union even in the UN. I don't think it is.
Part of the
Yeah, but it was established.
Independent.
And that's the regime. That's the regime, the ITU. It's not the UN.
we are
UN
running out of time.
some issues.
I would suggest that we
Some issues.
yes. So
So
1 minute for you answer, wrap up, and then I could suggest that we continue the conversation.
Outside, or,
Yeah.
such a nice day.
Continue this outside.
Trade agreements are
Nice
also led by bigger countries,
They are.
but their big countries have an interest. The US wants you to open your market to use this. When the US goes to outer space, it doesn't have any interest in most of the countries. They have nothing to contribute, so they don't really need a WTO style thing.
Why they don't do it at the UN? They don't care what
One
the
thing.
ED feels about.
So they don't do a WTO thing, they do a Artemis group. Thank you for all the comments, and we will follow up later on.